Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to what if the US invades Russia day by day. Let's hope this doesn't happen for starters. I mean, I do hope nothing comes close to this, but yeah, I mean, I guess this is just a video to see who would overpower who. And I'm going to assume it's going to be the US based fully on the fact that the military power that they have is another level. But at the same time, it probably wouldn't happen because Russia would probably just nuke the US and nuke the world and then we'd all die. But I should probably not say die at the start of the video because they're going to demonetize it. But yeah, YouTube are moving crazy right now. But anyway, we're going to jump into this video and see what would happen because yeah, with everything going on right now, again, I hope this doesn't happen. I don't think this will happen. I mean, but at the same time, you just don't know what's going to happen at this point. I'm saying happen a lot. I'm going to stop saying that word. But yeah, we're going to jump into this. Links are in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some more of my reactions. I've got a lot of series reactions, first time reactions, a lot of things that you can find on there. And also reactions to YouTube videos that I can't post and suggestions that people give me through the Patreon I've done there as well. But yeah, links are in the description for those interested. But let's jump into this and see how this would happen day by day. Probably take this with a grain of salt because, you know, it's just how you have to take these videos. But yeah, let's check this out.
Day 1. The plan to invade Russia had been in motion for 3 months, with massive amounts of men and material moved into staging areas around Europe and Japan. The powder keg everyone feared would be lit was about to explode. It all began with Lithuania blocking rail shipments from Russia to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, in protest over the war in Ukraine, effectively cutting it off from resupply. For weeks, Russia blustered and threatened and then did the unthinkable. Russian troops crossed the border into Lithuania to seize and secure the railways, linking the critically important Kaliningrad with the motherland. NATO immediately activated its rapid response force, pushing Russian troops out of Lithuania. Now the United States is preparing to do the unthinkable, and something that's very likely to trigger nuclear war.
That's supposed to be Biden.
It will invade Russia. U.S. troops have been staging in Poland, Norway, and Japan. The obvious choice may be one of the Baltic nations, but port facilities and airfields here are too close to Russia and under the threat of constant attack. At 0 hour, the American attack begins on Russia. It starts with a series of explosions along the western air defense perimeter Russia's established on its home soil to defend against NATO air attack. It's an extremely robust system of SAM satellites, fighter bases, and radar installations, the densest air defense network in the world. But the United States has several tools for the job. The first is the B-2 stealth bomber. With its lack of vertical surfaces.
See, this is still for me the craziest thing, like the craziest jet plane, whatever you want to call it. It's nuts. And imagine these flying towards you. I don't know what Russia's sort of, do they have similar planes? I assume they might do, but aren't these ones like, can't they like hide from radar and stuff? So how are they even going to detect what's going on?
It's the only stealth aircraft in the world that can also defeat long-range tracking radar, which
Well,
even the best stealth fighter is vulnerable to. The only clue to the incoming attack are intermittent anomalous pings on Russian radars. But by the time Russian fighters arrive to investigate, the B-2s are long gone. Radar and communication nodes are the first to be targeted by American B-2 stealth fleet. This knocks out a significant amount of Russian long-range radar, and a few hours later, B-51 bombers armed with standoff attack munitions fire volleys of missiles to crater Russian airfields and destroy fixed SAM sites. Unlike Russia's attempts to knock out Ukraine's air defense network at the start of the war, this is a concentrated and well-coordinated attack, reminiscent of the shock and awe of the first Desert Storm, when the US and allies destroyed the second best and most importantly Soviet-built air defense network in the world in hours. F-35s
Really?
move in to finish the job and knock out air bases along Russia's eastern border, as well as destroy rail infrastructure. Russia's mobility depends disproportionately.
I mean, rail structure, I don't know if Russia has, I mean, I assume they do. They probably have rail all the way across this. Because I know there's a football team, no one's going to care about this, but there's football teams mainly in this side of Russia, in like the main league. But there's a football team like literally right here. And I assume it's quite a big city as well, so I assume there is literally rail all the way along here. So if they destroy the rail, they're screwed. That would probably put the country on its knees.
Heavily on railways, hence its problems inside Ukraine. And crippling railways means Russia can't move troops and equipment until the rails are repaired.
Literally the city I was saying, bro. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's the city.
F-35s are nowhere near as stealthy as the B-2s and have to get much closer than the B-52s to launch their own attacks. But as Russian interceptors rise to meet them, they're greeted by a swarm of U.S. Air Force F-22s, which swat Russian
It's not fair, man. Just look at the comparison.
fighters out of the sky from beyond visual range. The US loses several F-35s and fourth-generation aircraft in the attacks, but Russia's ability to defend its western border from air attack is crippled. There are still many mobile radars and SAM units to deal with, but these are under dire threat from constant wild weasel attacks by the US Air Force. Once feared as a near-peer competitor to the US, the war in Ukraine has proven that the Russian Air Force is not even capable of neutralizing a much weaker country such as Ukraine. Poor training,
They've sort of showed that they're maybe not as powerful as maybe thought. I mean, they're still powerful because of all the aid given to Ukraine is probably helping. Well, it's not probably. It's helping a lot, sort of defending against Russia. But even then, it does show that as long as there's no nukes involved, they're not as powerful as maybe. Well, they're still the second most powerful country, but not as. It's not as going to be as hard for the US, let's just say, to do what they want to do. Plus, if the US get involved, also means 100% there'll be other countries involved as well.
Lack of communication, antiquated tactics, and bad maintenance all add up to devastating losses for Russia's air forces. Even as the U.S. airstrikes begin, American ground forces are already rumbling to battle. Abrams' main battle tanks and Apache attack helicopters smash into Russian defensive lines in Kaliningrad. With overwhelming air support, the battles are brutal but short. Russian armor is no match for modern American weapons, and its tank forces are so depleted by the fighting in Ukraine that modern Russian tanks are few and far between, as Desert Storm-proved Cold War Soviet tanks are no match for...
Their tanks get screwed by the Javelin weapon that the US have been given to Ukraine? I mean, I reckon they could literally just use all the Javelin weapons that they have in the country, and they'd probably win. So, I mean, the fact that you've got the Javelin weapons and you've got all these other things, ground stuff in the air, not really... Would any stuff be needed by water? I mean, Russia's got a massive coastline, but is it inhabited? I don't think any of it really is because it's so cold where the coastline is. But you've got all these options.
Desert Storm proved Cold War Soviet tanks are no match for even early model M1 Abrams, and especially not when working in conjunction with close air support aircraft like the Apache or the A-10 Warthog. By the end of the first day of the battle, Russian ground forces have suffered their worst defeat since the opening day of Operation Barbarossa. Day 3. U.S. forces have moved deep inside Ukraine where they're en route to reinforce Ukrainian units in the east of the country. Under intense air assault, Russian forces have been retreating across the entire eastern front of the war. Ukrainian troops have used overwhelming American air power to inflict devastating losses on retreating Russians, and American ground forces are having to rush to catch up with them. There is fear of overextension, but the constant U.S. air and missile assault leaves little room or time for the Russians to counterattack. The key to America's deadly efficiency is information. The U.S. military is the most networked military in the world, and unlike Russia, employs overwhelming amounts of smart weapons. It's been tracking Russian forces since the start of the war in Ukraine, and sharing that information with Ukraine to devastating effect. However, the Ukrainian army always lacked the hardware to make full use of the information. The U.S. doesn't. Adding to Russia's woes is a fundamental lack of operational security in its military. Most of Russia's radios are unsecured, allowing the U.S. to scoop up vast amounts of signals intelligence.
Oh, wow.
After spending 20 years hunting down...
They're going to get all the things that Russia are planning just because... Why is that, though? Why have they not got... Surely Russia's a country where they would consider not allowing that to happen with certain technologies.
Most of Russia's radios are unsecured, allowing the U.S. to scoop up vast amounts of signals intelligence. After spending 20 years hunting down terrorists in the Middle East by snooping through millions of radio and cell phone intercepts, the U.S. has gotten extremely good at the job. This is why in the real world, Russian generals have been dying on a regular basis, their location pinpointed by the U.S. and transmitted to Ukrainian forces. Now that the U.S. hardware is in play, the slaughter is exponentially greater. Russian command chains are broken across the eastern front, and its forces in general retreat to more fortified positions inside the cities of eastern Ukraine. Day 7. The battle for Kaliningrad is officially over. The fighting was brutal and intense, but under-equipped and demoralized Russian forces were ultimately overwhelmed by U.S. firepower. Psychological operations against Russian troops have been particularly effective. First is an overwhelming display of U.S. power in the form of precision air and long-range artillery strikes. Then radio broadcasts and even leaflets delivered by the U.S. Air Force promise amnesty for any Russian soldier who surrenders. With a large number of conscripts who are accustomed to poor, even abusive treatment, the psychological operation to demoralize Russian forces has been a great success. It doesn't help that many Russian forces here have been recently rotated out of the brutal fighting in Ukraine. If the Russian army could barely win against Ukraine, what hope does it have against the full might of the US military? In the east of Ukraine, American ground forces have joined the fighting alongside their Ukrainian allies. The arrival of vast amounts of American firepower has reinvigorated Ukraine's frontline forces, who are eager to liberate captured territory. But Russia is an artillery army, meaning they field many times more artillery than any other military in the world. And despite intense counter-battery fire and use of ground attack aircraft, the US is suffering its worst losses since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Day 14. The fighting in Kaliningrad is down to small guerrilla operations by Russian resistance forces. NATO forces from Spain, Germany, Poland, and Italy conduct anti-guerrilla operations, freeing up US forces to continue pushing into the Baltics. Rather than invade the Baltic nations as it once was feared Russia would do in case of a war, the Russian army has chosen to strengthen its defenses along the Baltic border instead. A wise move given the Russian Air Force's inability to deter US air operations. Without adequate air cover, any ground offensive against a military with the largest, most modern air force in the world is doomed to failure. Now US forces execute a push into Belarus from Lithuania and Poland. Belarusian resistance forces have been gathering inside Poland for weeks, undergoing training and being equipped by the US military in anticipation of an operation to liberate their nation from dictator Lukashenko. A popular...
So, is Belarus a country that doesn't, like, the people don't actually like... Because Belarus is quite close to Russia. I mean, it's very close to Russia. They're helping them with everything going on. But do the people of Belarus not really want that? And it is just because the people in control are choosing that? I guess it's like a puppet dictator for Russia or whatever. Or for Belarus, but for Russia. Sort of propped up by Russia. But the actual people there, would they, if it came to it, would they fight against Russia if they had the support of other countries? I mean, that's something that I don't really know about. I just assumed Belarus was culturally, and the people, the majority, prefer or like the idea of being close to Russia like they are.
Uprising against Lukashenko severely hampers loyalist forces' ability to repulse the invasion, and Russian forces sent in support are under intense and constant air attack. In Ukraine, the fighting has reached major occupied cities in the east, with Russian forces slowly but surely being expelled. However, urban combat is notoriously difficult and time-consuming, and heavily favors the defender. The U.S. is suffering its first major casualties in the fight to liberate East Ukraine. However, U.S. forces have been engaged in urban combat for 2 decades in the Middle East and have superior training and equipment. Cutting off supply lines to occupied cities also cripples the Russian resistance, as does morale issues which have reached critical levels. When they were fighting just Ukrainian forces armed with U.S. weapons, Russian frontline troops were already suffering from severe morale problems. Now faced with vengeful Ukrainians backed by American troops, morale is at a crisis point. Many units surrender without firing a shot. Day 21. A national mobilization effort across Russia has met with mixed success. With U.S. involvement in the Ukrainian war, the anti-war movement has picked up considerable steam. Many young Russians are refusing to show up when mobilized, and attacks on conscription offices are on the rise. The U.S. has fully mobilized its reserves as well, and behind closed doors at the highest levels of American power, discussions are being held on a new draft. While the U.S. completely outcompetes the Russian military, actually invading Russia and toppling the Putin regime will require many more combat forces than currently available, and the only way to generate the necessary manpower is a draft. Casualties are also mounting, and while the losses are heavily on the Russian side, the U.S. has suffered thousands injured and half that number dead. Of grave importance are losses in hardware. Modern U.S. manufacturing is poorly suited for mass replenishment of combat losses. With current U.S. defense production a fraction of what it was in the past, an invasion into Russia will cost huge amounts of hardware, and that is not going to be quickly replaced. U.S. industry can surge to building 28 Abrams a month, but if the U.S. is to maintain a credible deterrent against China, it'll need many times that number.
A month? Oh my goodness.
Production of fighter aircraft is likewise limited, with perhaps 150 F-35s a year now being built. A surge might bring that number to 200. To put it simply, U.S. focus on advanced weapons and a reliance on overseas manufacturing means that American civilian manufacturing is poorly suited for a transition to wartime production of weapons. It's either going to have to win this war quickly or resort to less and less sophisticated weapons to do so. Day 30. At the end of the first month of fighting, Russian forces have been pushed back to within miles of Ukraine's eastern border with Russia. It's only stubborn resistance inside dense urban cities that's slowing U.S. forces down. Russia has learned not to engage the Americans or their Ukrainian allies in open country anymore. It's just inviting destruction either from the air or from smart precision artillery. A plan for an amphibious assault on the Kamchatka Peninsula is cancelled as fears over mounting losses of equipment have led to a redeployment of forces from Japan to the European theater. Instead, the U.S. Navy launches a number of raids against Russian military airfields and ports in the region, destroying the Russian Pacific Fleet completely. Russia's Far East, however, is relatively strategically unimportant to the nation, as it's too far from Russia's economic hubs to matter much. Thus, the losses do little to affect the war. The strategically important port of St. Petersburg has been blockaded since the start of the war.
Well, there we go then. Wait, St. Petersburg's on the coast?
The strategically important port of St. Petersburg has been blockaded.
Unless it's just like a river, a big river or something. I didn't know St. Petersburg was on the coast.
Since the start of the war, and the U.S. Navy launches periodic strikes against Russian forces in the city. Russia fears an amphibious assault incoming, and American Marines are spotted staging inside of Estonia for just such an operation. But it's a feint meant to draw Russian attention to the defense of the city and away from the fighting in Belarus. Inside Belarus, Lukashenko is a president in exile as U.S. and liberation forces free the capital city and march on a retreating loyalist force, hastily making for the Russian border. Under intense air attack, few of the forces make it to the border with any semblance of cohesion. Once at the border itself, they're met with betrayal. Much like Russia did in our real world to its separatist allies retreating inside Ukraine, the country now refuses to allow non-Russian forces to cross the border. Rather than fight, many surrender. Day 45. U.S. armor chases retreating Russian units across the Ukrainian border and into Russia itself. For the first time since World War II, Russia is now under invasion by a hostile foreign power. Along the Belarusian border, U.S. air and long-range artillery has been devastating Russian defensive positions in anticipation of an assault across the border. Precision strikes have targeted lines of communication, supply depots, and concentrations of heavy equipment. Russia has far more artillery than the U.S. and responds with overwhelming volleys of fire. However, the U.S. is better at counter-battery fire, and artillery duels tend to end with the U.S. on the winning side. U.S. air power has taken significant losses dismantling Russia's vast air defense network, but is still extremely capable and available in large numbers. It's this air power that's most lethal to Russia's artillery forces, who are under regular air
Look at that. Fucking hell.
attack. U.S. stockpiles of smart weapons have begun to run low, though, after a month and a half of intense combat operations. Dumb bombs are being upgraded with smart kits to make them weapon or GPS guided, and superior targeting capabilities by U.S. planes means that even dumb gravity bombs strike with great precision. By comparison, Russian smart weapon stockpiles are now completely depleted. Already running dangerously low by the 5th month of the war in Ukraine, Russia's stockpiles of modern weapons are all but exhausted. It's now putting Cold War relics into the fight with predictably poor results. But Russia has still a significant pool of manpower and conscripts to throw against the invading U.S. forces. As the invasion of Russia is set to formally begin, American commanders consider the dangerous logistics of going up against hundreds of thousands of Russian conscripts. Even if armed with vastly inferior equipment, the sheer number of defenders means U.S. forces could be overwhelmed if they overextend. The best strategy is to keep those troops from even fighting in the first place. U.S. PSYOPs have been working overtime to demoralize Russian troops and convince the Russian people to rise against the current regime. The U.S. promises that it has no intention of holding any seized Russian territory. In fact, it would be wildly impractical to do so, and instead states that its goal is the removal of the Putin regime. This message resonates with many disenfranchised Russians, especially amongst the younger generations. The crushing defeat suffered by Russian forces in the last 45 days helps steer many toward an unwillingness to fight. But many Russians see it as their duty to defend their homeland from any invader and have fierce loyalty to the Putin regime. A civil war is brewing inside Russia, and it might be the U.S.'s only hope of a successful invasion. Without support from the people, it's unlikely an attempt to remove Vladimir Putin from power will be successful. And that's if he doesn't resort to the use of nuclear weapons. Given the Russian military's incompetence, it's all but certain that the U.S. will also face the use of tactical nuclear weapons against its forces. This can only mean one thing: an equal retaliation by the United States. The dangerous climb up the nuclear ladder that only leads to one place: complete annihilation. Despite its vastly superior capabilities, even the U.S., sole superpower on Earth, simply cannot successfully invade Russia and defeat it without, in effect, defeating itself. Now go watch.
That's what I'm saying. It's not going to end well for anyone. So let's hope this doesn't happen. I mean, Putin and their regime, let's hope they get out and they can be kicked out as soon as possible. But yeah, that nuke button is looking real good to Putin right now if this comes into play. But wait, to be real, if the USA even moved as much troops near Russia, they would press the nuke button faster than Twitter bot would yell racism. Alternative title: US attacks Russia and Russia just watches. The only problem is wars never go according to plan. Yeah, true. I guess as Russia have experienced, that's a very good point. But yeah, if you want some more reactions to the infographic show, let me know in the comments. And yeah, until next time.